to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me. And they asked me, what's his name? What shall I say? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said further, you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. And God said to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. That's my name forever. And this is my title for all generations. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The Old Testament lesson in Moses and the burning bush is one of those stories that could be seen as a joke, actually, except the joke is on the human participant of Moses. It's like the story of the preacher who decided to play golf one Sunday morning rather than go to church and preach. First hole, hole in one, amazing. Second hole, hole in one, amazing again, astonishing. Third hole, down in one, right down the middle of the fairway. Miracles abound, the preacher said. The preacher was feeling really great as he walked up to the fourth tee. Moses and God are watching. And Moses is a little miffed that this man of God isn't in the pulpit on his Sunday morning, as was deemed his right. But God says with a little smile, who's he going to tell? Moses is doing ordinary things with ordinary hands, leading ordinary sheep in what he thinks is an ordinary life. How familiar does that sound to you? And then he encounters this bush, and this sound, and this noise, and this fire. You make a lot out of the bush, and the fact that it was never burned up. Lots have been written about that, how that could be, what kind of bush it was, what kind of fire it was, whether it was a single flame or an all-encompassing flame. But the bush wasn't the issue for Moses. For Moses, the issue was the voice that he heard. The voice that came out of the bush, the voice of God's call to Moses. Because God confronted Moses with a purpose for his life. No more ordinary things with ordinary hands, leading ordinary sheep in an ordinary life anymore. As people of faith today, I think we fall into two kind of camps. Some have had a confrontation with God, and others long for such a confrontation with God in their life. And our life breaks open when we have that confrontation and we realize that there's more to this life that we're living than just the ordinariness that we've known up until this point in time in our life. When confronted with God's call on their life, John and Nancy and Bob and Terry and Joy and Laura said yes. In the case of our story this morning, it was Moses' call. And it happened in several different ways, I think. First, God speaks and says, I am the God of history. I'm the God of your ancestors, of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Jacob and Rachel, and I made promises to them of life and liberty and land, a place to live. And even though my people were in captivity in Egypt, I intend to keep those promises. In the midst of an ordinary and maybe complacent life, God rudely interrupts and intrudes. I've heard the cries of my people, God said, and I feel sorry for them, and I've come down from the heavens to rescue them. I can imagine Moses saying after that little momentous occasion in his life, you know, God, I've heard of their problems too, and I'm glad you're going to do something about them. Let me write you a check to cover some of their expenses. God smiles, that same smile that he smiled at Moses earlier on the golf course, and says, I don't need your check, Moses, at the moment. I want you to go down to Egypt and tell the king to set my people free. After Moses thought about that for a minute, I can imagine him forming two questions in his mind and two comments in his mind. The first would be, if you're so all-powerful, God, why don't you take care of this yourself? Why do you need me, a human, to do what is almost beyond human strength and to tell this Pharaoh to let your people go? We never do anything like that, do we? We never say, well, if I were God, I'd make this happen. Or this wouldn't happen. Either way, God doesn't need me. God can do all of those things. We never say that, do we? Second thing I think that Moses did verbalize, which is more a protest than anything else, and something else we say a lot, is, I can't. I can't go. I'm in trouble with the law. I killed Pharaoh's man in Egypt, remember? And he's got my picture on a wanted poster in his office, and he's after me. I can't do this. I'm an ordinary person, God, in an ordinary job, and I like it this way. Thank you very much. It never fails. Every year, I've been involved in a congregation. When elders and deacons are nominated and considered by the congregation to be at the next class of elders and deacons in that particular congregation, after, in the process of being nominated, somebody goes to them from the nominating committee and says, hey, we would like to have you as an elder or a deacon. We think you would make a great elder or a deacon doing these things. We think that. That committee has gotten together and processed names, and your name kind of floated to the top, and we really do think. And so they come to me and they say, almost verbatim, I don't know why I'm being nominated. I'm not worthy. And my response has always been the same. That's the point. None of us are. Moses realized that because the truth is, through this God that came through that voice in that bush, this awesome God of power, for whatever reason, he didn't fear the challenge. He wasn't completely scared away. He was brought into this power of God's Spirit at work in his life. And he followed through with that call. This awesome God of power caused him not to fear the challenge that was in front of him, not even in front of the king of Egypt. He knew what he had to do because he trusted in this God. God made a promise to Moses' ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now has come to enlist people into this promise and to bring them in for the future of the world. My seminary professor, Walter Bruin, says that the wondrous resolve of God is transposed into dangerous human work. The wondrous resolve of God to make all things right again, to bring all things into order again, is transposed into dangerous human work. It's not all grace and glory. There's an amount of risk involved in what we do as well. God's promises sometimes, perhaps over time, oftentimes see their holy end by God's people and empowered by God's Spirit. That's who we are as the church. That's our task as people of God. I think it's important to mark well that God is not oblivious to what is going on earth. Scripture cannot be plainer. I have seen the abuse of my people. I have heard their cries, and I will come to help them. But you go and do the work. In today's church language, we call that missions, or evangelism, or outreach. We call it speaking for justice and righteousness for all of God's people. God is not oblivious to what is happening and going on down here today. Moses has been called out to do mission, to take the liberating, freeing Word of God right into the sitting parlor of the most powerful man on earth. Past moderator of the Presbyterian Church, Marge Carpenter, said that the focus of the church needs to always be on mission, mission, mission. It's all out there. And I agree. The Church of Jesus Christ will live or die because of its involvement in outreach and engagement and mission and evangelism and taking the word to the lit streets and the dark places and the halls of justice and the halls of government. In a society where we have a hard time seeing beyond our own bank accounts and our own gated communities, our self-importance that we've gotten ourselves into, we've forgotten that the church doors open outward. And when we exit through those doors, after a worship service, we don't go back into the ordinary life of ordinary work with ordinary sheep to tend. We go back into a different world now because you have answered the call. All of us have answered the call. See, if it can happen to Moses, it can happen to us. Right? It can happen to us, and we can find ourselves one day hearing and seeing and answering a call and being pushed out those doors by a wind of a spirit, pushed beyond our normal expectations of what we had in mind for our own lives, pushed beyond our own imposed limitations. I can't do that. We can't do that. Pushed by a God who keeps promises, because that's what God does. It's possible to go on in life, I suppose, as if God's intervention in Moses' life, God's intervention in your life never happened. It's possible, I suppose, after worship to walk out of these doors into an ordinary life again, wondering what was going to happen, what was going to be like, life was going to be like today, having your lunch, going home and watching a game where commercials cost, how much? 8 million something? 30 million for 30 seconds? But God does intervene in your life. God does intervene with the opportunities to use our gifts that we possess, trusting in God's work through us as we recognize the power of God in our lives. And when we recognize that power, we recognize the promise of freedom that it brings, and the promise of freedom for the world that still exists today. And you can be a part of that. These who will come in a few moments have said, yes, I will be a part of that. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, took notice of Moses as the story unfolds later on as he shows up. And we remember the stories, all the plagues that came through, and the final plague that came through. And finally he said, yes, get out of town. And Moses and his people did. And then they got caught by a river and by a sea, and miraculously opened up in front of them, and they were set free, but only for a short amount of time, because they found themselves wandering in a desert for up to 40 years. before freedom ever came their way. It wasn't really until hundreds and thousands of years later that freedom finally came, hanging on a cross in Jerusalem and in an empty tomb a few days later, when that call came to be real in the life of all of God's people, and freedom was given. Pharaoh took notice of Moses. It's time for the world to take notice of us. What are you going to do to answer your call? For those who have ears to hear this morning, hear.